One of the hardest moves for an NHL general manager to make is acquiring a goaltender in season. On today's edition of Locked On Oilers, a historical analysis of trades that worked out.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On today's episode, a larger, burgeoning conversation about goaltending. Today's show, we're going to hone in on recent NHL history and not so recent NHL history for in-season goalie trades that worked out well for both parties involved, or at least the team acquiring said player, which is really what our focus is here, because part of our argument and part of what we're trying to do with these episodes where we're talking about goaltending is making the case as to why the Oilers need to go out and add a third goalie to this mix. So we're going to start there with a big conversation about why this is hard to do. Our first segment today is going to be all about why trading for a goalie in season is difficult, why the longer you wait, the harder it becomes for that goalie to be successful. Our second segment will point to a few individual trades that worked out particularly well for the acquiring team. We'll point out one trade in particular that didn't. And then in our final segment, we're going to tie a bow on this, talking about the latest reporting around the Oilers and the goalie position. So if you're a regular listener of Locked On Oilers, you know the intense passion I have for respecting your goalie. I am always going to defer to a goalie for the most part because it is the hardest position in hockey, and it is probably the second hardest position in all of sports behind quarterback in football. But unlike quarterback in football, as a goalie, you don't materially impact the game to the same degree. You don't touch the ball every offensive play. A goalie most nights is going to face something in the ballpark of 25 to 35 shots on goal. In today's NHL, that's about your average expectation. So about set half of the plays in a given game that end up on the stat sheet. There are infinitely more plays in a game that don't. All of the pre-play movement, the passes, the zone exits, the zone entries, the line changes, the face-off wins, all of the little details that go into describing a sequence of a play, those don't show up in the stat sheet. When we talk about it in terms of just the raw counting stats, you get hits, you get block shots, you get shots on goal, you get assists, you get goals. Those are really all that's going to show up on a given stat sheet. And it's why a goalie has such a hard time superseding or overcoming their environment. Now, the greats at their position, regardless of sport, are capable of elevating their supporting cast. We see that all of the time across the board. That's always the conversation in football as far as quarterback play. Can you elevate your team? Can you make the guys around you better? We see that in hockey from time to time. Connor Hellebuck undoubtedly elevates the ceiling of the Winnipeg Jets. The Jets probably don't have a top 30 player in the NHL other than maybe Josh Morrissey, but that team is having one of its best seasons since its relocation to Winnipeg. You can point to the Igor Shesterkin season 3 years ago that he won the Vezina Trophy for and finished fourth in Hart Trophy voting. You can point to a few of those Pekka Rinne Nashville Predator teams. You can point to some of the UC Saros Nashville Predator teams. You can point to Ilya Sorokin 2 years ago on the Islanders. There are enough examples that I could keep going on and on. You know, Henrik Lundqvist in 2011, 2012, that first real year of John Tortorella as the head coach. There are plenty of examples of the all-world elite goalie elevating their team and giving them a chance to win. And the real conundrum there is at a certain point, the price points of your goalies, the returns start to diminish. And that's why teams start to try and outsmart the system. You know, how much more valuable is a goalie who's getting $7.5 million per year from $5.5 million per year? And that $2 million, it doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a restricted free agent. That's one more top 9 forward or top 4 defenseman if you have one that has team control. So with that in mind, that brings us to our first real inflection point in this conversation. Teams don't want to add goalies in season because they understand it's really difficult for them to acclimate successfully. There are plenty of talented players at that position, but number one, if you have a good goalie, because there aren't enough for all 32 teams to have a good starting goalie, even if you don't love your guy, if he shows you enough to be average, you're going to ride that out. And that's kind of the boat the Oilers are in with Stuart Skinner right now, where yes, they absolutely could stand to improve that goaltending position. Depth-wise, they could use the third goalie just to have as insurance if one of their 2 guys gets hurt. And then number 2, they really need someone to push in Skinner's direction to make him have another incentive to play better. And look, I understand you don't want to have someone breathing down his neck and risk hurting his confidence, but at the same time, he needs to be pushed. And when you have a guy who has shown you the ability to be good, but not as consistently as you'd like, it presents a real conundrum because the Oilers undoubtedly are one of the 6 or 7 best teams in the NHL, but with goalie issues, with defense issues, and those 2 issues are inherently tied together. With those 2 problems, it's hard to envision a world where they're going to be able to play perfect defense in front of Stuart Skinner against a Vegas, against Winnipeg, against a Colorado. And you don't want your margin for error to be small. What have we been talking about all year on Locked On Oilers? You want to have as many paths to victory as possible. You want to put your guys in a position where they have multiple paths, multiple ways forward. You don't want to be in these low scoring, low event, high volatility games, because what happens when you end up in a coin flip where it's 50-50? Sometimes you're going to lose that coin flip. And if you end up in a lot of tight checking, low scoring games, if you're depending on your defense and Stuart Skinner to be perfect or close to it, that's a really tall ask. And I think fundamentally, the Oilers are going to end up reaching this decision, conclusion, whatever you want to call it. It's just a matter of if they reach it after this year's playoffs or if they come to this conclusion down the road. And look, this is not an indictment of Stuart Skinner. He is what he is. He's a slightly above average goalie who is prone to really good stretches and frankly, really bad stretches. But when you have the opportunity to improve your position in season, you got to do it. And goaltender is probably the Oilers' weakest link right now. And I understand they're still trying to get John Klingberg acclimated. He's not going to play in the game on Tuesday night against the Lightning. This episode is going out on Wednesday. I'm recording it Tuesday afternoon, but he's not going to play tonight. Troy Stetcher's going in. They're trying to acclimate a top 4 defenseman. That's something that needs to be ironed out. And the sooner you get your new pieces in here, the better, because those guys are going to need time. We are going to take our first break of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we're going to visit some of the more successful in-season goalie trades, the characteristics of said trades that made them successful, what the Oilers could learn from them, and a whole lot more coming up next on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, so be sure to stick around. Did you just realize your business needed to hire someone like yesterday? How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. When it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other sites. Indeed sponsored jobs put your post at the top of the page and help you reach the right candidates faster. We've all been in that spot where our team needs the right hire, like yesterday. The pressure's on, and every day without the right person is a setback to your team. That's exactly when Indeed sponsored jobs come in handy. They make sure your post is seen by the right candidates right now. Now, you can speed up your hiring process with a $75 sponsored job credit. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need. And a very hearty thank you to everyone hanging out on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers, as we're talking about the history and successes of in-season goalie trades. And look, I think the prevailing wisdom around the NHL in today's landscape, as far as the deadline, is that you don't want to have to make a big trade at the deadline. You don't want to have to go out and get the biggest name, the biggest star, because the underlying assumption there is if you really need to go out and get that big of an impact player ahead of the trade deadline, the group you already had in place didn't have enough to get there. And we have seen specified, targeted additions really help out Stanley Cup winners over the last handful of seasons. I keep running down this list in my head on this episode, on the show, whenever we talk about this. But Tarasenko last year for Florida was a really heady top nine forward. Didn't cost a lot against the cap. You go the year before that, the Golden Knights went out and got Ivan Barbashev and Jonathan Quick, really small, top nine forward, backup goalie. The year before that, you go to Colorado, Josh Manson, not a huge trade, something nice. Arturi Lehkonen, nice he played a top nine role on that team. Tampa Bay, before that, you talk about David Savard, Blake Coleman, Barclay Goodrow. The year before that, Zach Bogosian, and they had traded for Barclay Goodrow and Blake Coleman that first time around. But you get what I'm saying here. Yeah, the small tactical move that augments a depth piece of your lineup, that really strengthens a piece of your team. That's why this goalie trade, the big in-season goalie trade, is so hard to execute. We saw one fall apart last year. If you go back, you remember that first week of February in 2024, there was a deafening amount of volume around Jacob Markstrom being traded from the Flames to the Devils. Ultimately, that trade did end up getting consummated after the season. But when you're a team that's looking to add a goalie in season, it puts you in a disadvantageous position for a few reasons. Number one, most teams, if they have a goalie that's good enough to be considered trading for, they're not going to trade them because there aren't enough great starters to go around. Teams are very reticent to move on from a starter they feel confident in. That, number one, drives up the price. It's really hard to get a fair price on a goalie. And I think the Oilers are facing that problem right now. There aren't a lot of great candidates out there. John Gibson, Karel Vejmelka, those are the two that really come to mind. But other than that, you're not going to want to give up a ton for either of those guys. And Anaheim might be willing to just kind of get rid of John Gibson, and that's a different conversation. But Utah's not going to just get rid of Vejmelka. He's good enough that you want to hold on to him on the proposition that maybe next year you might be good enough to push for a playoff spot. But if you look through recent NHL history, and then one trade that's not so recent, but it's near and dear to Oiler fans' hearts, the most prescient two that come to mind, I should say the most prescient one, the type of trade the Oilers should be looking for as far as goalie is what the Minnesota Wild did 10 years ago when they acquired Devan Dubnyk from the Arizona Coyotes. Dubnyk only cost the Wild a third-round pick. Dubnyk did not have a ton of NHL experience to that point, 100-something starts at the NHL level. He'd hung around. He'd been on a few teams. Of course, he was originally an Oiler, bounced around, spent some time in Arizona, a few other places. But he got to Minnesota in January of 2015, and he went 27-9-2 in the starts he made as a Wild goalie, and spent several years with the Wild after that. He wasn't expensive. He was $800K against the cap when they acquired him. He, of course, signed an extension after that. It was like a $4.5 million per year type deal. The Wild made the playoffs 4 times with Dubnyk as the team's starting goalie. That's the mold you want to be looking for here. If you're Stan Bowman, you want to be looking for a goalie that's on the younger side. Dubnyk was, I think, 27, 28 when he was acquired, but didn't have a lot of miles on him, didn't have a ton of NHL experience. Somebody that's what we would call or profile as a change of scenery candidate. Someone that has the physical traits to be successful, size, athleticism, but for whatever reason, It's not working out where they presently are because the team around them isn't good enough. But we feel if we drop him into a good environment, we're going to be able to get more out of him. Those Minnesota teams trademark great defense, Ryan Suter, Jared Spurgeon, really, really good defensive teams. That was really that's really the calling card of the Minnesota Wild franchise, is being a really strong defensive team that's well-rounded, 5 or 6 quality D-man, and it makes their goalies' life easier. Then you have to deal with the fact that Dubnyk was an undervalued asset because he was in a bad environment. Those Arizona teams post their conference final appearance in 2012 didn't have a lot of talent, a consistent brain drain of guys getting drafted, playing reasonably well. Keith Yandel comes to mind, got traded to the Rangers. OEL eventually got traded, but you get what I'm saying as far as that's the kind of guy you're probably looking at. The other guys on this list are a little bit different. Craig Andersen went from Colorado to Ottawa in a straight goalie swap. Ottawa sent Brian Elliott to Colorado. Craig Andersen went to Ottawa. Ottawa, of course, got their all-time leading wins guy in their 2.0 iteration. Since the Senators came back in the early 90s, Craig Andersen has the most wins of any goalie. A straight goalie for goalie swap isn't something I think is in the cards for the Oilers. I don't think you're going to get a starter that much better for Stuart Skinner. For Stuart Skinner, you would probably have to add stuff on top of that. Craig Andersen wasn't expensive. He was only making $1.8 million against the cap. The Senators got 4 playoff appearances, words are hard, out of him. And then the one that comes to mind for the Oilers, the problem is there is not somebody who fits the Dwayne Rolson role. Very near and dear to Oiler fan hearts for his role in the 2006 Stanley Cup Finals appearance, the run that got them to Game 7 against the Carolina. Dwayne Rolson was towards the end of his career, mid to late 30s, trying to win a Stanley Cup for the first time in his career. And there's nobody that really fits that bill around the NHL. You could maybe say Marc-Andre Fleury as far as older goalie just trying to win one more cup. But Minnesota's going for it this year. They're not going to trade away somebody they feel confident enough to start in a playoff game if something were to happen to Philip Gustafsson. Jonathan Quick, he doesn't profile as a starter anymore at his age. I think Jonathan Quick would probably make the most sense as far as just backup if you wanted to add a second guy to this mix that you would feel okay starting a few games in the playoffs. I think that's very different than the type of conversation this episode is largely about, where we're talking about teams that acquired starting goalies that ended up getting really good results out of them. Of course, Rolison left Edmonton after that season, went on to greener pastures for a bigger payday. Ben Bishop going from Ottawa to Tampa Bay. Bishop got traded for Corey Conacher, who was having a really nice rookie season for Tampa Bay in a 4th-round pick. Conacher got put on waivers the following year, never really became all that much. Bishop was a very solid starter for several years for Tampa Bay, eventually ceded the throne to Andrei Vasilevsky, who's been one of the best goalies since. But Ben Bishop, change of scenery. These are the types of goalies that become available. The guys with traits, the guys who you see the idea for, but the environment isn't working. And there's not a great answer here. There's nobody that really comes to mind as far as change of scenery. If you wanted to talk me into like Daniel Vladar of the Flames, not really giving me a whole lot of confidence as far as being a starter. I just don't see it there. So we are going to take one more break on today's show. We're going to talk about 2 more in-season goalie trades that, for varying reasons, I don't think apply here, but could serve as a bit of a warning. Coming up next, right after this. So be sure to stick around. And thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this edition of Locked On Oilers. The one goalie, and I thought of this while I was watching the animation roll. The one goalie that entices me for this type of conversation for an in-season goalie trade. Well, actually, it's whichever one the Sabres like less. You could talk me into a world where the Oilers acquire Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen or Devon Levi, and I would feel a lot better. Now, the Sabres operating from a position of strength, having 2 goalies, and they've really brought Levy along slowly after throwing him to the Wolves last year. I would love the Oilers to be able to bolster their goaltending room with guys who have, Pekka Luukkonen's got a good track record. I think last year at the end of the regular season, I had him like fifth or sixth in Vezina Trophy voting, how good his season was on a bad Sabres team. I think Pekka Luukkonen is worthy of consideration. And then Devin Levy's mostly a forecast. He's a projection that based on how good he's been at the college level at Northeastern, you would assume that he's going to eventually figure it out at the NHL level. Other than that, there is not a goalie that really comes to mind. If you wanted to try and talk me into like a Spencer Knight reclamation project, I don't think you're doing that in season. And that brings me to the last point I want to make before we talk about the two trades of warning. Goalie trades are off-season maneuvers. For the most part, you bring in a new goalie in the off-season, so you get a full training camp, a full preseason to ramp them up, to get them comfortable, to put them in a position to succeed. The problem, of course, is you don't know if you need a goalie until, December, January, February, if you're a team that's on the fence about your goalie room. Now, if you're one of the teams that has a guy that is making 55, 60 starts, this conversation doesn't apply to you. But it would not surprise me if the Oilers came into the year and said, well, we feel reasonably good about what Stu did last year. We're going to keep an eye on it. And if an opportunity arises to improve our team, we're going to take it. And there are other factors to consider here. The Oilers do need clarity on Evander Kane, who is eligible to be traded after next week, which that does help. He goes to a 16-team no trade clause list. And I don't know what the market would be for a player who hasn't played hockey in 10 and a half months, who still has a few years left on his contract. The Oilers would almost certainly need to retain money on that deal. But with that in mind, with the fact the Oilers probably need to go out and get a defenseman, the fact that the Oilers probably are going to need, or probably are going to add, even if they don't need another top nine forward, there's a lot to consider here. There are a lot of moving parts, and I think fundamentally the goalie is the most important of the three, of adding a top nine forward, one more defenseman. I think when you look at the struggles that Skinner and Pickard have had, and look, it's all relative. I understand the Oilers have a very good record. I understand they're second in their division. I understand they can largely get by with this average to slightly below average goaltending, but for one, I know this is the Oilers' last chance with this cheap permutation. We're not going to be far away from McDavid and Draisaitl and Evan Bouchard's combined cap hits pushing $40 million for just three players. That's not far away. That is not far away. Leon's raise kicks in next year. Bouch and McDavid's kick in the following year. The Oilers are not far away from needing to make big moves. No, excuse me, Evan Bouchard is eligible for restricted free agency this upcoming summer of 2025. So his new contract will kick in coinciding with Leon, and then Connor's new deal will kick in the year after, so 2026, 2027. But you get what I'm saying here. When you have the opportunity to strike while the iron's hot, while you have players dramatically under their value, and look, that's one of the keys to the Oilers roster composition, is that as expensive as Connor and Leon are, they're also undervalued relative to their production. Those guys are worth probably close to $17 to $20 million per year if you were to accurately value their contributions in all situations. Bouchard is dramatically underpaid relative to his production. I know the perception is he's having a down year, but if you watched yesterday's episode, I think I've made a strong enough argument that this is probably somewhere close to the low end of his potential, and more likely than not, you'll see him end up somewhere between this year and last year for consistently throughout the rest of his career. He's only 25, only 4 full seasons at the NHL level. He's got probably a little more meat left on that bone to digest to get a little bit better, but the Oilers have an opportunity in front of them. If the Oilers can survive the Western Conference playoffs, the Oilers are going to be in a position where the team coming out of the East will not be as good as them. Florida, as good as I think Florida is this year, and we'll see because the Oilers are going to play them on the second half of a back-to-back tonight, I really want to see the Oilers capitalize on what is an opportunity. And coming out of the West, it's not going to be easy. You know, I think we've dispelled the notion that Connor and Leon can't get it done in big moments. I think they are very much capable of winning big games. You saw them do it last year. They won 5 straight elimination games across the Vancouver and the Stanley Cup Final Series. So believe. But if the goaltending continues to feel like this elephant in the room where we got to do everything in our power as a team to minimize their workload, well, we're going to have to concede offense. We're going to have to generate less overall offense to play better defense. And then that changes our calculus. But real quick, the 2 trades that I do think are worth mentioning here. Ryan Miller going from Buffalo to St. Louis in 2014. St. Louis gave up a lot. They gave up a 1st-round pick, a 3rd-round pick, Jaro Halak, who was a starting goalie in a tandem, and then Brad Stewart, who, solid top 9 forward, decent NHL career. And Ryan Miller left after that. He played 1 playoff series. The Blues lost in 6 games to the Blackhawks, who they lost in the conference finals to the Kings, who went on to win the Stanley Cup. That Blues team was pretty good. Alex Steen, TJ Oshie, Bo Meester, nice pieces of a good team, but ultimately it took a few more permutations to get to the mix that ultimately won the Stanley Cup in 2019. But adding the big name goalie, and look, I can't call John Gibson a big name goalie anymore. He hasn't had an above league average season in quite a while. I think he's still a decent NHL goalie, but there's no way of knowing how good he's going to be. And I know the Ducks acquired Ville Husso from the Red Wings yesterday. I think there's a strong possibility that was in preparation for trading John Gibson once he's healthy. He's currently injured, so that's another wrench in that possible trade. Lucas Dostal's been very good for them as a goalie. I think he's firmly put the Ducks in a position where they feel they can move on from John Gibson. I think he makes sense for the Oilers in a vacuum. But again, when we talk about the market, how much he's going to cost, the cap hit, all of that is a consideration. And then you got to throw in the fact that even though it's on the record and Stan Bowman has no incentive to be honest because you don't want to tell other teams what you're thinking, he told Frank Saravalli he's not really looking at adding a goalie to this team and just that he thinks Skinner and Pickard had a bad weekend. So you can read into that however you want. I'm always a little skeptical of a general manager or coach taking anything on the record because they have no incentive to be honest. They can't. It is not in their interest to be honest with the public as far as their trade moves, their lineup decisions, because all they can do by being honest is hurt themselves. If a coach is honest unnecessarily, you might hurt a player's confidence. If you're a GM, you might drive up your own price. If he goes on the record and says, yeah, we're looking at adding a goalie, well, Utah, Anaheim, and anyone else with a goalie that might be for sale is going to keep that in mind and really start to try and drive a harder bargain. But that will just about do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you happen to be listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. And thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen today. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NHL podcast, bringing you the daily league-wide stories that matter with the local coverage you love from Locked On. Find Locked On NHL on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I will talk to you guys tomorrow after the game against the Lightning and after the game against the Panthers. A whole lot going on. See you guys then.